Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone online. This is so exciting. I am Melody Brown-Birkins. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center. And the Dickey Center, as some of you may know, is a place at Dartmouth. It's absolutely an incredible place to work, where we bring the world to Dartmouth and we send Dartmouth out to the world. And the Institute of Arctic Studies is a part of that, where we bring the Arctic to Dartmouth, and we send students and faculty and partners around to the Arctic. And what we really think about, it's not just the Arctic, we think about the environment, we think about climate, but what we're doing is really making sure that Dartmouth is a part of solutions, a part of listening to other cultures and peoples, and being a place where people can come together and think about the big issues facing the world through different lenses. Sometimes it's a lens of climate modeling and scientists. Sometimes it's a lens of artists. Recently we had a poet from Iceland, and on that we now have today, we're very excited, we're going to have not only an anthropologist, but also a writer who is and an incredible leader in issues of gender equality and history, and a lens that we haven't had in here to speak before with Margaret Willson. And I'm first going to say a little bit about what I love from the opening of her book that she's going to speak to you about. Online it says, a daring and magnificent historical narrative nonfiction account of Iceland's most famous female sea captain, who constantly fought for women's rights and equality, and who also solved one of the country's most notorious robberies. So if that doesn't tell you want to listen to this, I don't know what will. If you've already started the book, you will have seen what an incredible writer she is. But let me tell you that Margaret Willson is first and foremost a very good friend. She is also a cultural anthropologist, as I mentioned, living in Seattle, affiliated with both the anthropology and Scandinavian studies programs. She grew up in a small town in Oregon. Then at age 18, after she says a mere 2 months at university, she took off for the complete unknown of the South Pacific. She spent the next several years working her way around the world, taking all kinds of jobs and landing in numerous adventures, which I would keep loving to hear. It's one of the things we get to go out and do afterwards. At 23, she returned to the university and took an anthropology class, and she said this is what she realized was her calling. She earned a PhD at the London School of Economics, and then just decided to stay there for several decades. I'm kidding. She could not be held still. She instead took on a professional, creative, and life path that, in her own words, has been quite eclectic and winding. So she's been involved in teaching, working in film, co-founding and co-directing a nonprofit based in Brazil, conducting international research in the Arctic and around the world, and writing for both academic and non-academic audiences. Her research and projects have taken her to Papua New Guinea, where she worked with Chinese traders and later in a remote village along the Sepik River. She worked in Inner Mongolia, the favelas of northeast Brazil, and most recently throughout Iceland. Throughout it all, she is a writer of stories with language that, as I mentioned, just takes you in with the first page and the first sentence. So tonight we will hear about her incredible book, Woman, Captain, Rebel, one of the best titles I think I have ever read. Before that, she also wrote Sea Women of Iceland, Survival on the Edge, a book that became a finalist for the 2017 Washington State Nonfiction Book of the Year. Her other books include Dance, Lest We All Fall Down, Breaking Cycles of Poverty in Brazil and Beyond, which was a silver medal winner for multicultural nonfiction in the Independent Book Awards. She edited a book, Taboo, Identity, Sexuality, and Erotic Subjectivity in Anthropological Fieldwork in 1995. And in 1990, she wrote the Ethnographic Film Catalogue, Volume 2, at the Royal Anthropological Institute of London. And for the creation of this book in particular, she received the Snorri Sturluson Icelandic Fellowship in 2019. She wanted to conduct research on a historical Icelandic female sea captain who essentially did a hashtag #MeToo movement 200 years ahead of her time. With that, I hope you recognize you are in for a wonderful, wonderful surprise and lecture tonight by Dr. Margaret Willson. Thank you.
I didn't know I had that much information online. I was just saying to Melody, I didn't know I had that much information about myself online. And she's got it. Very impressive. So Actually, I'd like to start this evening with something that's really important to me, with a memoriam, actually. Although, I'm responsible for this book in terms of what's written, a book like this takes a community. And it's also, how is knowledge created and how is knowledge held? And one of the people who was really important for this book was a fellow named Thurídur Guðmundsson. And he lived in this small town where Thurídur came from. And he had, Todi was his nickname, he had the memory of a savant. He could go back 200 years or more and tell you all the people who lived at various farms. His family had lived there probably for 1,000 years. He could also tell you exactly how all the ships came in. We went to the shore and we had old maps and he showed me exactly where they came in. It's a kind of knowledge that is lost with his passing last week. And the reason I particularly want to say this is because his funeral is today in Iceland. And he was a very good friend as well. So, to tribute to him. But I'm also, so much of what happens in our lives has to do with connections and chance, I think. I don't know, do I believe in chance? I'm not positive, but it seems to, like a thread through so much. And for me, this whole adventure of working with Thurídur, working in Iceland, was quite by chance. In the early 2000s, I bought a house in Seattle, the center of Seattle, which at the time I couldn't even afford it then. And it's quite a big house. And so I started renting out rooms. And one of the people who took those rooms was a woman she was an oceanographic physicist, and she was an Icelander. And shortly, we became good friends. We're still very close friends. And she invited me she was going to Iceland for a visit, and she invited me to come and visit her there. I thought, this is before Iceland was the tourist place it is today, and I thought, when else am I going to go to Iceland? So I took off and went. And she took me, so hopefully I'll do this correctly. She took me outside Reykjavik about an hour to show me her sights, as a generous host would do. 2 such sites as this. This is the coast just north of Stokkseyri, where Thurídur was from. And then we went to Stokkseyri. This is Stokkseyri, which, except for the wall is higher and the houses that are modern, it looks pretty much like it did 250 years ago, actually. And then wandering along the back streets of this little town community, we came across a hut, sod-covered hut. It actually looked a lot worse than this then. And she bent over the plaque in Icelandic next to it, and it said, 1949, this is a reconstruction of the winter fishing hut of Thurídur Einarsdóttir. She lived from 1777 to 1863. Now, I worked at sea when I was younger as a deckhand. I grew up in a fishing community, and history would have us believe there aren't any female sea captains in history. 0, none. There's some pirates, but not a real sea captain. So I said, this famed sea captain, was a woman? And she goes, yes, my grandmother told me stories about her. I said, really? To say, when they said it's a winter fishing hut, this is a painting of what, these huts are actually nicer than that one. You'll see that they're later, a little bit later, this is about 1890, but this is what it was like. They had open rowboats. That's what they went out in. That experience changed my life. I was working in Brazil, but I gradually shifted to working in Iceland, and eventually to this book. This book reads almost like a novel, but it's nonfiction. And this is because of what Iceland is. I just want to explain, we have to look a little bit at Icelandic history to understand this. Some of you may know this already, of course, but Iceland is the place of the Icelandic sagas, which have inspired everybody from Wagner to Tolkien to Game of Thrones, just so many people, and they are brilliant. They are brilliant, remarkable literature. And they were written in the 1200s, but they were from times earlier. And Iceland was the Vikings. But then through, I'm sad to say, political infighting, they lost their independence. And then for 600 years, they lived under incredibly oppressive rule of Denmark. They didn't get independence until 1944. And they lived in hovels that weren't much better than that hut, the reconstructed hut that I showed you. They often didn't have heat. Every spring brought starvation. They lived this way for centuries. But what they did have, and this is at one point their population went down to 25,000 people. But what they did have, and what has preserved their language, was the sense of literature from these sagas. Everybody knew how to read. By the 1700s, you had, men and boys and girls had to learn how to read at least well enough to pass their catechism. Girls weren't taught to write particularly. Why do women have to know how to write? But men were. And they copied the sagas. They memorized the sagas. They memorized the poetry. And it was considered incredibly valuable. The people who were poets were the most highly respected people in the country, except for, up there with fishing captains, honestly. And they used poetry all the time. They remembered it. People would say conversations that they liked, they had really good verbatim memory. So what you had was all these people are just farmers. They wrote all the time their own stories. And they wrote, thinking of the sagas, they wrote about love triangles. They wrote about betrayals. They wrote about just small incidents, and they wrote verbatim conversations. And this has been preserved. That's what's so amazing. It's unlike about anywhere else I've ever seen. So Thurídur, when she became quite notable very young, when she went out fishing at 11 with her father in these open rowboats, she started catching, she was quite small, but she started catching fish really fast, really well. And so he took her on as a deckhand immediately. She started working with her father. And when she became more and more respected for her ability to find fish. And very quickly also it was noticed that she could read weather better than about anybody else. Her observation powers were phenomenal. People wrote about this. And then when she was a teenager, she started wearing trousers. This is in the late 1700s. Women did fish from there, and they did wear trousers sometimes at sea. There were women who did, but nobody wore them on land except Thurídur. And she didn't do it to disguise herself as a man. She just thought she liked them better. That was it. It was said she wore a skirt to church, but she apparently wore trousers underneath. So she worked for her brother, and her father died when they were quite young, and then she worked for her brother, and she then became really acclaimed. It was clear to everybody that really she was running the boat, and everybody started going to her for advice. Now, there was another guy. This is what's so cool. You get all this stuff, right? It's like, what this book is, it's a time, a community. It's one person's life, but it's so much more because there's this materials available. There's a guy who, against every possibility, became rich, very young. We called him Jon Riki, young, rich. And he had a boat. He was older, about 7 years older than Thurídur. And so the best deckhand around at this point was Thurídur. And so he really wanted her on his boat. And so her brother's boat got destroyed. And so he, in the conversation that is recorded, he got her to be his deckhand. So she became his deckhand. Now, I'm going to read from the book, just to give you, it also gives you an example of the kind of detail that, and just amazing personality that comes through. Before I do that, I just want to show you, oh no, wait, the other way. This is the kind of boats they were in. This is from the 1890s as well, it's a photograph, but the boat hasn't changed much. So there are these long, open boats in these Arctic seas. Lots of people died. So here's a section from the book. When Thurídur is working for him, right? Before she becomes captain. Their captain, Jon Rich, soon arrived because they're going to go out fishing. And they dragged the boat across the rocks and into the water, joining 8 other boats on the open ocean. Thurídur, as usual, surveyed the weather. Good now, but unsettled, sure to change. And sure enough, a strong, sudden wind sprang up. They pulled in their lines quickly and rushed toward the nearby Erebaki shore before the surf rose. Everyone else did the same. The skerries at Erebaki lay in a parallel line out from the shore, with boats entering a narrow gap between skerries. Only one boat could enter at a time. As the waves got worse, Jon Rich's boat skimmed over the water at speed, one of the first to arrive at the channel entry. Thurídur took note of the tide. Returning through the Erebaki passage on an ebb tide was much more dangerous than a rising one. She nodded in satisfaction. Luckily, the tide was incoming. They pulled the boat from the water and paused to watch the other boats arrive. 6 made it swiftly to shore, but 2 with clearly weaker crews lagged behind. Thurídur glanced at her crewmates. Not good. Surf was mounting fast, already cresting over the outer line of skerries. The lead boat, which held 4 people, entered the narrow entrance, veered in the churning backwash, crashed into one of the outer skerries, and became solidly wedged against the rocks. No matter how hard they pushed with their oars, the crew couldn't get it off. Violent surf now smashed the boat back and forth against the sharp lava. They'd break up in no time. As Thurídur and everyone else watched, the second boat, close behind them, intentionally veered its own course directly toward the skerry. At great risk to themselves, they would try to save the stranded men. This was going to be tricky. Any overweight made a dangerous difference in these open boats, especially in rough waters. Unbalancing it could make it easily flip. Still, through buffeting waves, the crew members managed to pull 2 of the stranded men into their boat. They'd now overloaded it, its gunwales riding barely above the waterline. Any more weight would sink them. An impossible choice of who to save with no time for debate. They left the other 2 men behind. As the others rowed to safety, those 2 clung desperately to the damaged boat as it began to break apart, filling steadily with water. On the rising tide, the waves now crested over the skerry and would soon submerge it. Then they'd drown. Thurídur glanced at her crewmate Gamlason. They'd seen this tragedy too many times before. They all then looked to Captain Jon Rich. Any rescue attempt was his responsibility. He yelled to the other skippers, "Aren't you going to give me people so I can get these men?" The other skippers looked out at a sea increasingly white with froth. the Skerry a good 1,200 treacherous, watery feet from shore. They shook their heads. Neither of the men were kin. They wouldn't take the risk, so no one did. Jan Rich shrugged and turned to his crew. He tried, more than anyone else was willing to do. It's probably not a good idea to attempt to rescue these men from the Skerry, he commented. I'm not going anywhere. Thurídur kept her eyes on the two men struggling to stay above the sea's greedy maw. It will be known to the authorities if you don't make an attempt to get these men, she said very quietly. Jan Rich's other crew members stopped what they were doing and stared. Jan Rich jumped up and glared at Thurídur. Then you take my job and be responsible for the ship and crew, he shouted. Not that he expected her to take his angry invitation seriously. He should have known better. Thurídur considered her captain's words. She assessed the risk, the distance, her crewmates. She nodded. I'll do it, she said to Jan Rich. I'll guarantee the safety of the crew, she paused, but I can't promise the same for your vessel. She looked at her crewmates. They looked from one to another. They'd go if she led them. Jan Rich gave her an infuriated wave and stormed up the bank. Thurídur and her crewmates quickly pulled the boat back into the water and set off. With Thurídur at the helm, they rowed rapidly through the spray, sliding alongside the Skerry in minutes. Then, balancing the boat, they dragged the two men aboard. Thurídur ordered them to shove off fast. In an instant, they were rowing towards shore again. They'd done it, and they hadn't even damaged Jan Rich's boat. But the following year, the authorities issued an award for bravery in the daring and courageous rescue of the two shipwrecked men. They awarded it to Jan Rich, who happily accepted it. So that, I want to show you. That's a painting of what it was like coming in. Thousands of people died. So then Thurídur, sometime after this, she was made a captain. And so she left Jan Rich, and he quite betrayed her during this. I won't go into this, but he quite betrayed her, which had a lot to do with how he treated people, honestly. And that's all recorded too. And he hated her for that. He hated her because he fished better than anybody else with her on board. But now she was a captain too, on a boat that was bigger than his. And he no longer fished the most. Her boat caught at least as much as his did, if not more. And he hated her for this. And all their lives, he tried to destroy her. In 1827, there was a robbery. It was a home invasion robbery of a very wealthy farmer, who everybody disliked, by the way. And in this society, when the huge majority had nothing, with massive inequality, and the Danish and the small elite of Iceland did everything they could to control the people and keep them suppressed. So something like this was completely unacceptable and had to be stopped immediately and the culprits found. But the Icelanders themselves were a bit reticent because it could be their kinsperson, of course. They don't know who did it. Also, Stokkseyri and Eyrarbakki, these fishing towns, were considered much more, they weren't able to be controlled because they were fishing. So they were considered disreputable. And also, the elite was really scared because of the French Revolution, which had happened a while ago, but they were really worried that the Icelanders were going to rise up and guillotine them or something. So guess what so in trying to find the culprits, the county commissioner, he had all the power in that area, he went to Jan Rich, who had got himself made a deputy by this time. So he's had some, it was about the only sort of office that a regular Icelander could hold. And so he went to Jan Rich, asking Jan Rich to help. And Jan Rich did not want to help either. But he saw a way to get back at Thurídur. So he said to the county commissioner, "Oh, you know, the person who's the most observant of all of us is Captain Thurídur. I'm sure if she can't solve this, no one can. She's going to be better than anybody." So he shoved it onto her. Now, the county commissioner knew that Thurídur wouldn't want to help him either. So he laid a trap. So I'll just read you the small part of what happened. What he did, first of all, to say that she was tarring her boat, wearing trousers and a top, and they were covered with tar. And so he sent a messenger to tell her she had to come, and she said, "Oh, well, I'll change into a dress," because that was to see the commissioner, right? And the messenger said, "No, you can't change. You have to come right now." So she had no choice. She followed him to the county commissioners, and this is what happened. She arrived at the very nice house where the county commissioner was staying, entered the parlor, and greeted him. Commissioner Thurídur greeted her and returned, motioning the messenger and others hovering around to leave, although they didn't go very far because they recorded exactly what happened, so they must have been just at the door. Glancing down at her tar-spattered jacket and trousers, Thurídur told him that she'd been working when his messenger rushed her to come without giving her a chance to change. "Yet I should not have come before you dressed in this way," she apologized. "The same goes for me as others," Commissioner Thurídur replied. "I have heard before now that your everyday wear is men's clothing, but for that you need a license." Well, in reality, no record of such license seems to exist, and we looked. Scholars looked. There was some from saga times for cross-dressing, both men and women, but it was abolished in 1280. We're long past 1280 here. We're 1827. Nowhere is there evidence of this supposedly required license. Not that this made any difference, as County Commissioner Thurídur could say whatever he liked. He expected Thurídur to be reluctant to help him. He clearly considered this and laid out his trap before she arrived. "This license I will obtain for you," he now said, "if you will give me a hint as to who robbed the Camber farm." Effectively, the county commissioner gave Thurídur no choice. She'd help him or he'd prosecute her for wearing trousers. "Who was robbed and where?" Thurídur asked. He outlined the facts he knew of the robbery, including the items found at the scene: a tattered hat, an iron rod, and a dropped shoe. "May I see the shoe?" Thurídur asked non-committally. Commissioner Thurídur pulled the shoe out of a bag and gave it to her. She turned it over in her hands, examining it carefully. "The woman who made this shoe is highly skilled," she said after some consideration. "It's been worked in a special way that I have seen in only 3 farms." "And where's that?" Commissioner Thurídur asked eagerly. This was unexpected. Was she going to give him a name now? With an impassive look, Thurídur told him that the first of these farms was his own. Commissioner Thurídur flushed, unsure whether to be complimented at the skill of a woman at his farm, probably his wife, or to be insulted at the idea that someone in his household could have been associated with such a crime. Was Thurídur being clever, mocking him, or making some sort of point? It's the latter. He settled on a defensive middle ground. "True," he agreed, as if he knew such sewing details himself. "But do you suppose that my men have been on such a business?" "I do not suppose so," Thurídur replied evenly. "The second farm is from Gilvrebeir, which is the pastor's farm, also the person who owned the boat she worked on." She paused. "But I am sure the robbers are not from there." She then stood in silence. The county commissioner gave her a steely glare. Name the third. You have to read the book to find out third. So it's what was so exciting about doing this book was that women just, the amount of information is so scanty. And there was, with my amazing research assistants and people like Toddy who really helped me, so many people worked together. People photocopied old manuscripts and gave them to me. People transcribed things because they were on this old Icelandic and Danish to be able to read them. We went through dusty archives of pages after pages of handwritten documents. And what emerges is such, I mean, you can tell, such detail of the lives of this whole community as Thurídur's life runs through it through a thread. I might say, you know, solving a crime like that, you know, in the detective novels it's always so great, but in a community like that, it's not such an easy thing. But this book gives us a way into a life, and what I find so amazing, and just an existence, is that as I read it, I was moved as I am by things today. I mean, it had so much resonance of what we go through today. That's what was so surprising when you get such detail. So I feel really lucky that I was able to find all this information and do the book. That's it.
I am going to, well, thank you. And of course, you did. That was a little cliffhanger in there. She mentioned she has one of the best publishers. I'm guessing the publisher has made sure that you you do this, make sure that we check it out. I have read only the first chapter because I've been busy and I just can't put it down. So I do hope you take a look at it. And really, this is, again, what you're mentioning is this research of, you showed me some of the logbooks, all of this, that just the detail that was kept. And so I thank you for taking us through that. I want to open up to any questions from the audience here, and then we have a few online. And Sana will come, thank you, Sana, and give you a microphone if we need, because that way people online can also hear it for our recording. Is that okay? Would that be good?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay. Anyone with a question?
Hi, thank you. The question is, how far would the boats go out when they were fishing, and what kind of fish were they catching?
It was, what they were fishing mostly was cod, diurnal fish, and they didn't go out very far. I mean, something like Stokkseyri, why Stokkseyri was so good, and now no one fishes from there, by the way, was that it had these reefs, so you could get out, and then the shelf went off, so there were really deep pools, so they could get cod. They also got haddock, they also got halibut. But the main one that was the boat that they could export, the Danes would then export, was cod. And they did it on single lines. They did it single. There was some whaling from different parts, yes, and they still wouldn't go out very far. That was a really scary thing to do, but they didn't do it in this part. The south coast of Iceland has almost no bays. It's just what you saw, these huge waves. And so that's why they could go out with these skerries, but the surf would just rise up. I mean, I've seen enormous waves there. And they'd go out there and fish for survival and to make any kind of, well, they got fish. I mean, fish was counted as money. And so they would bring it back. Yeah, and they did on single lines for a long time until the 1860s. Yeah, I know, it's amazing. Rowing, they didn't start using sails until about the 1860s too. And they were really dangerous because the sails, they still had the same boats. And so a gust had hit it and they just boop, go over. And almost everybody died if they fell in.
Thank you. How long, so she started this career at a very young age, and how long was she going to sea? What was the length of her career?
Until she was 63. She was rowing until she was 63. And then she was living in another town at that point, and she started a side, she was worked at a merchant house, but she also, handling the alcohol, but she also started a side business guiding the Danes around who were terrified of going, fair enough, going anywhere in Iceland. And so she guided people. And there are these incredible accounts of her going over, she goes over this amazing pass where they almost get killed. And so some Icelanders and we retraced it. It's like, what? So, of course, we drove part of it, but, you know. So, yeah, she was amazing. So she did a long time. Yeah, in the freezing cold all winter.
Any other questions? Oh, back there. Thank you. Oh, wait. Oh. But just wait. This way the people can hear it from.
You mentioned that she was 200 years ago, and she was a woman doing things that we don't think women would be doing. But there was a pirate in Ireland called Granuaile, and she was doing some remarkable things as a pirate in the 1500s.
Yes.
How do you...
And that's one of the only records that we have of somebody who, she was a chieftain, and she met with Queen Elizabeth and everything to get her freedom. She was amazing. Sadly enough, and there is a really good book written quite some time ago on her. Unfortunately, the details of her life are sketchy. I mean, there's not much. There's just, you know, and people have done the best they can with what they can find. And what's different about Thurídur is that it's totally detailed. Like she lived with two men when she was in her 20s, and she just said she wasn't going to marry them because if you married a man, then he was then your master. He had complete control of you. And she said, I'm not going to do that. So it's incredible detail, and it's also called Grace O'Malley. I mean, it's really sad that there isn't more, and that's the tragedy of especially women. You know, I don't know that there aren't more women who are chieftains or captains. There were some other captains in Iceland, actually, that I have found through my research, but on them, there's not very much. That's what's so amazing about Thurídur is because of this robbery, people wrote a huge amount about her. So that's how we can get it.
We have a question online, but before that, I will just say I think that was something I was picking up is there could have been many more.
Could have been.
And that's the tragedy of and something that's really important that's today as well. Sometimes it helps us think, who aren't we speaking about now? Who is not making the history now? And it's that kind of looking back to understand that really, well, maybe there was more than one, but we don't have the records. And so being thoughtful of that. So thank you, that was a good question. That was a helpful question.
And just to say that, you know, in Iceland today, except for this community, I dedicate this book to one guy who at 16 16 in the 1850s. He could barely write. He grew up on a farm. And he started interviewing Thurídur when she was older. And he started writing it down. And it took him and he interviewed everybody around. And he worked on this until he was in his 50s. And then he published it in a series of handwritten newspaper articles in the 1890s. You know, his book is dedicated to him and to the people of Stokkseyri and Eyrarbakki who have kept her knowledge alive of her, the knowledge alive of her. Besides that, the older people in Iceland will have heard of her, but not the younger people. It's completely gone. So the fact, if there wasn't this written record, it would be yet another woman who would be erased from history. And you know, how do we create our reality? How do we create what we think of as reality today? I mean, my other book, Iceland images its history in fishing as male. But with my research, I found that in the 17 and 1800s, certainly a full third of the fishing fleet was women. They've just been completely erased, and they were captains. So yeah, where else? Where else? I mean, from fishing, you can just fill in whatever you want. Where else in history, women, whoever, have just been deleted? And so we create a reality now where we say, there weren't women doing this, there weren't whoever, you're going to fill in the blank there, didn't do this. Well, we don't know. We just create a reality from erasure.
And would you like to read the question, please?
Yes, the question is, how is your story and research being received by women and young women in Iceland? And what is the current role in fishing in Iceland?
How is what received? Sorry, what was the first one?
How is your story and research being received by women and young women in Iceland? And what is the current role in fishing in Iceland?
Book hasn't come out in Iceland yet. It's coming out at the end of this month. I mean, it's only been out here a couple weeks. But I'm very honored to say that the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid, she's endorsed it. That's on the front cover. Nobody's going to know she's the First Lady except for people in Iceland and me. And they can't say the First Lady of Iceland because then that sounds like a political endorsement because she's, of course, doing it herself. But I take that as a great compliment. And, you know, when I wrote my previous book, Sea Women of Iceland, which was as a foreigner, telling Icelanders that from what my research was, that their image of their own history was wrong. It's a very vulnerable thing to do. And I was very scared. I had many Icelanders read it, but I was scared when that came out because I thought they could hate me for it. I mean, I could just be vilified. There were people at the beginning, especially men, it was mostly men who were involved in research of fisheries, who did say, oh, we don't believe it. But luckily, that book was so well referenced that that attitude has changed. And I am so grateful because Icelandic people now really celebrate that book, actually. With this book, I am doing a similar thing that there's a lot in this book that is controversial, actually. But the records are amazing. And they're all cited, it's all there. So we'll see, but I also, in this one, I had enormous support from the people of the community she's from, and these people who helped me, these scholars who helped, they transcribed these documents that there's no way I would be able to read them. You know, that you have to be a scholar in that kind of writing to be able to read it. And so there are a lot of people who worked on this book, actually. So we'll see. Most of the Icelanders I know are raring to buy it and excited to see it. So we'll see. I'll be curious to see. There aren't, sadly enough, when I published my previous book in 2016, I interviewed a lot of women in 2013, and there were a lot of women. I interviewed about 200 women working at sea, and there were a lot. But because of, we won't go into this today, but because of it's called transferable quota, they've made the quota into a commodity that you buy and sell. Because of that system and a lot of other things, you have very, very few women working at sea there. You have a lot more working in Alaska. They did a different type of quota system than you do in Iceland now, which I think is really sad.
I will follow that up and give a little plug to we have other folks in the audience here who are very connected, and as is Dartmouth Institute of Arctic Studies is actually very connected to the Stephenson Arctic Institute, the University of Akureyri. Oh, well, it's with the government of Iceland. And I was going to say, I remember, I think it's Dr. Catherine Chambers who's doing... Kat Chambers, who we were just speaking on a Zoom when you were here before, and the president of Iceland was here, which was so awesome and wonderful, and was talking about cod wars and all sorts of wonderful things. But that I think she's starting to getting some interest, if I understood it correctly, with some of the research going on at the university, but also with the community to get young women out to sea. I think it's a new program she was working on.
She's trying
to get some of this history in front of the young women of Iceland, and then sponsor, I think, summer programs to get them out in boats and fishing and seeing what that might do. And it was something she was just starting, and she was telling us about it on a Zoom. And so it was just, prompts me from that question. It's just
No,
such
no, it's really exciting. And also, I mean, Iceland is, it is touted as having the most gender equality in the world. Just doesn't at sea right now. But there are people like Kat's one person, and then also Austa, a woman who works for the Ministry of Transportation. She's starting a lot of programs as well, but in that case, it's particularly their search and rescue organizations and their equivalent of the Coast Guard. So they're trying, but it's difficult because they're private companies running it. So, but they're very aware of the issue.
Oh, another question. Thank you.
One is that you're saying that the all the dialogue that you have in that book is documented?
Yes,
Because as a nonfiction book, you can't just put in dialogue.
absolutely
So,
not.
and that's incredible.
It's incredible. There are, I actually make a note of it. There are a couple places where they say, and I say this in reference notes every time I do this. I was very careful. They say, she said, I want to go to sea today. And it's not in quotes in the original. And I have sometimes put that as, I want to go to sea today, in quotes, she said. I've shifted how it's written. I've shifted quite a bit of how it was written, because it's written in a very archaic style that's almost unreadable, you know, if you translate it. But if I do even that small a change, I have it in the notes and saying this was not originally in quotes. Okay. So those ones I read you just now, those are all recorded by people who were like deckhands with her or somebody who was there at the time.
And then
it's outrageous.
reported it to somebody and it was recorded.
Yep,
Wow.
absolutely. And what is that? They have these, everybody does poetry, they're screaming poet at each other. Either laudatory poetry or they fight with poetry too, like, you know, rap wars or something. And that's all recorded too. They say, oh no, you have to destroy it. Nobody's supposed to remember it. Well, they did. You know, they wrote it down. So, and their memories for this kind of thing it's still pretty amazing. They still do this, but because of this tradition of memorizing all this poetry from the 1200s, these are just farmers and people, they had a mind for this. And so they wrote down things. If somebody was notable, which she was, and so they wrote, yeah, I'm not making any of it up.
Wow.
That's what's so amazing. In fact, I'll just tell you, I started to write this as a fiction book. I wrote a whole third of it as a fiction book. And I thought, what are you doing? You've got so much information. I was just almost quoting from them anyway. And I thought, this is really stupid. I don't think it's fair to her or to women, actually, or to Iceland, or to anybody, because they're going to say, well, you're just making it up. I thought, well, then I junked that and I started over again because it's such amazing detail.
And also I wanted to, because you said the name of the town of where she was from again? Where
Yes.
this all happened?
Yes. There's two communities. They're still about the same size they were then.
And they're still there?
They're absolutely still there. In fact, how long this will be the case, but there are people there who can, for instance, she was also, it's too long to go into but ghosts, like I say, people who we call ghosts, but they're very different in Iceland, and that line between this world and the other is much more permeable. It was then, it is now. And so ghosts they're not like these specters that you barely see. They say they just look like humans, only they're not. And so there was a boy who was turned away in the winter by her father, and he cursed their family for 9 generations. And that ghost hung around, Mori was his name, until the 1980s. People saw him until the hundreds of people saw him. So today, but for how long I don't know, people there can show you the exact ditch where he died.
Are there monuments there? Are there?
Nope.
There's nothing like if
No,
the tourists go?
and so, for instance, I'm one of the people, the holders of knowledge at this point. When you have people who I talked to, Toti, who died, he knew all these places. And another guy, Gary, who I actually dedicate, I say in memoriam, because he died last year, right as I guess it was last year, right as the book was coming out. He passed away, so I was able to put in memoriam to him in the book. But he had massive knowledge. And so these people took me out, like there's this, where Thurídur brought in her boat. They know exactly where it is, and there's this chipped out kind of a basin that still exists, where they would put fresh water, would rain fresh water, where they would all wash the fish. They know exactly where all this stuff is, because the landscape hasn't changed. But right now, all these people from Reykjavik, because it's an hour
I
in
was gonna
decent
ask you
weather,
that, yeah.
because Reykjavik is too expensive, they're moving and they're building new houses now. And so all these people are moving in who don't care. And the people who remember this are older, in their 80s. And so it's going to be lost. So I'm happy, I was really lucky I did the book when I did it, honestly.
And what were the names? You mentioned there were two. What were the two communities? Just what were the names?
So Stokkseyri, so it means Stokks is the first part, which means the first settler there in 845 or something like that, when he came, Iceland was uninhabited. And so he came from Norway and he was trying to figure out where to land, and he threw a stake, a stock, to the shore. And where it landed, he decided was a good spot. And that was Stokkseyri, and that's where he landed his ship at the time. And Eri means kind of a flat space below the mountains. So the two places are, and then Erebaki is also, Ere means, it's the same word, but at the beginning, and it's sort of like a bank, a flat bank that's arable. So these are the two communities that were about 400 people, and still, well, it's changing right now. They have been. It's you go along the south coast. So it's just south of Selfoss. You know the area? It's south of Selfoss. It's on the coast from Selfoss. So if you go basically east from Reykjavik, about an hour on that coast. So, and some friends of mine have an amazing guest house, by the way.
I was going to ask, like, since you've directed your focus towards like Iceland, like obviously you're working in other places before, like how do you feel like the outsiders, like non-Icelanders perspective has like changed on how they're writing about it, like in literature, in nonfiction? Like what I feel like Iceland has got a lot of attention like recently, in my understanding of it, like more so than usual. So like what people are kind of writing about, I guess, or.
Yeah, I mean, I have really mixed feelings about this all. It's not for me to say in one level, but I will anyway, in my opinion. You know, when I first started going there were no tourists. And then they had the huge economic crash in 2008 and almost went bankrupt because of 15 fishermen who decided to invest billions of dollars and with this quota system. And they, instead of going bankrupt and going under, that they turned to tourism. It did save their economy. It's now larger than fishing. But you have a country that's not that big, and you've got 300,000 people in the whole country, and you're getting millions of tourists. And it's very fragile. You know, it's the Arctic. It's right on the edge of the Arctic Circle. And also, they've done films there. I mean, there's one community where I spend a lot of time, Grundarfjörður, which is about halfway up the west coast. It's a beautiful place. And it has this mountain that's kind of stuck in the bay there. It's an outrageous mountain. It looks like it's just like, it looks striped. Anyway, so I haven't seen Game of Thrones, but I mean, I haven't seen it. I kind of avoided it for a whole bunch of reasons at this point, but they apparently used it at the beginning, calling it the Mountain of Doom. Yeah, anybody? And because of that, all these people want to go there to take an Instagram picture of it. And apparently there's a beautiful waterfall, and they want it with the waterfall in front and the mountain behind. People are trying to climb it too, by the way, and all these foreigners dying because they're falling off. Everybody says, you can't climb this mountain, but they're doing it. But what they did is they've started to destroy the whole area around there. And so the people who live there, and they're also parking, and causing a lot of accidents. So they've had to build a big parking lot, and they have now a wooden walkway so they don't try and trample. But they're encouraging them too. So the government's encouraging them. So it is bringing money, but it's only to a few people. What's also, in terms of what are their beliefs, like this thing about ghosts. Icelanders don't talk about that very much, and the power of dreams. So you're not hearing about that so much in the press, but you hear about their beliefs in the hidden people and what they call elves, which is alvar, which means the kingly people. It's very different than our concept of an elf. And so you get all this foreign press writing about, oh, Icelanders believe in elves, isn't that cute? Ha, ha, ha. Whereas actually it has a lot to do with their relationship of the wildness of the land. It's sort of what the land is and the spirit of the land. And what's happening now is Icelanders are feeling embarrassed. So they're doing two things. If it's an elf spot, now instead of being sacred, it's a place that tourists go. And for themselves, I'm just noting a shift. So things like that, it's difficult, it's complicated when they're a very small group of people and they're having so many people in. But the tourism dollars have saved their economy. So I don't know, at what cost?
Thank you. That was an absolutely perfect question. That was really I learned so much just there. I'm going to talk to you more. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Margaret. What a wonderful presentation and all the questions you've just taken. And thank you, everyone, for being here. There are some books outside, and I'm seeing a few gifts I'm going to be giving people. So thank you again for being here.
And thank you all for coming.